We live in an age of fake news, when we're constantly warned not to trust everything we see or read. But fake news and deception have been with us a lot longer than the internet. You only have to look at how the Allies used it in 2 world wars to see that. And when it comes to faking it, using lookalikes to fool the enemy seems to have brought dividends. Here's how. Growing up, I always had a great fondness for war movies, particularly those surrounding the Second World War. Of the many that I saw, one sticks in my mind a little longer than others. I Was Monty's Double told the true story of the actor Clifton James, who entertained troops during the war by pretending to be British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery. It was Monty who helped crush Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps in the Western Desert. He was then tasked with helping to plan Operation Overlord, the D-Day landings in 1944. While Monty's military career was going from strength to strength, James, who had been an actor before the war, was engaged in somewhat less stimulating work as a second lieutenant in the Army Pay Corps. About 7 weeks before D-Day, a newspaper article reported on how James had performed as Monty during a patriotic show. An intelligence officer spotted the uncanny resemblance, and soon Operation Copperhead, a scheme to misdirect Nazi spies, was hatched. James learned Montgomery's mannerisms and speech, and was even fitted with a prosthetic finger to replace the one he'd lost while fighting in World War I. Monty was a non-smoker and teetotal, so James had to give up the booze and the cigarettes to be truly convincing. And so the deception began. While the real Monty got busy planning the invasion of France, James was flown to Gibraltar, where at a reception in the Governor-General's house, he dropped hints of Plan 303, a bogus invasion of southern France, which were overheard by German agents. With those little seeds sown, he was then whisked off to Algiers in North Africa, where he made several public appearances with General Maitland Wilson, the Allied commander in the Mediterranean, just to give Nazi spies the impression that something fresh was afoot in that military theatre. 5 weeks later, the Germans were left reeling when D-Day took place, and Monty was in the thick of it as one of the main commanders directing operations. James, on the other hand, found himself back in his old job with the Pay Corps, trying to explain where he'd been for the previous 5 weeks. Meanwhile, over in Russia, Joseph Stalin was having something of an identity crisis. The supreme leader of the Soviet Union is said to have had no less than 4 lookalikes to act as his decoys to thwart spies and would-be assassins. One, Rashid, was said to be so like the leader, right down to pockmarks on his skin from a bout of childhood smallpox, that he was dismissed from the army because of his uncanny resemblance to Stalin. He was later recruited by the NKVD, the Soviet Secret Service, to act as a decoy and would sit in at meetings and formal dinners. Rashid's fascinating job came to an abrupt end in 1953 when Stalin died. The lookalike moved out of Moscow, shaved his hair and moustache, and tried to blend back into society. Despite all his precautions though, he would still find himself being stared at in the street due to his similarity to the late leader. Rashid died in 1991, aged 93. Another body double was Felix Dadayev, a one-time dancer and juggler, who was injured in the fight to retake Grozny from the Germans in 1942. Impressed by his resemblance to Stalin, intelligence chiefs faked Dadayev's death and spirited him away to transform him into the Soviet leader. Dadayev was almost 40 years younger than Stalin, but the rigours of war had aged him. That, combined with some well-applied makeup, did the trick. The Soviet leader's voice was not so familiar to Russian citizens, so all Dadayev had to do was to practice Stalin's mannerisms and gait in order to dupe onlookers. His role too was to appear at ceremonies and rallies all across the USSR in place of the real leader. Once, he said, he stood at the mausoleum in Red Square to review a parade of athletes that filed past. No one suspected a thing. In an age when there was no television and people rarely saw their leaders up close, the deception always worked. His most important appearance as Stalin was when the Soviet leader travelled to the Yalta Conference in 1945. Stalin's flight was shrouded in secrecy, but Dadayev's was in the full glare of publicity, making him a ripe target for would-be assassins. In 2008, Dadayev, aged 88, wrote about his wartime secret in an autobiography, Variety Land. Military intelligence, wartime archives, and Russian state security back up his extraordinary story. I can't help imagining the conversation at a lookalikes reunion though. Stalin 1 and Stalin 2 comparing moustaches, while numbers 3 and 4 discussed the tips on backcombing to achieve the desired bouffant style that Stalin had. It's one thing to impersonate a well-known leader, but how do you go about fabricating an entire invasion force? The lookalike army was one decoy that really did hit the mark during World War II, in the run-up to the D-Day landings. Operation Fortitude was split into two parts. Fortitude North was a plan to fool the Germans into thinking that there was an invasion planned for Norway. Fortitude South was aimed to fool Hitler and his generals into thinking that an invasion would occur in the Pas-de-Calais area of France, northeast of Normandy. But how do you conjure up an army? The Allies used a combination of techniques. German military intelligence intercepted fake radio traffic that referred to movements of the fictitious 1st US Army Group as it gathered resources and mobilised for an attack. Dummy landing craft and inflatable tanks were created, as were fake aircraft and dummy airfields, all to give the Germans the impression of a large force being gathered to attack the Pas-de-Calais. Heading this imaginary army was none other than US Lieutenant General George Patton, a flamboyant officer who wore a pearl-handled revolver strapped to his hip. Patton was held in high regard by German military, who couldn't imagine that such a distinguished officer would merely be used as a decoy rather than out in the field campaigning. Diplomatic channels were also used to leak information in neutral countries that could then be passed on to the Germans. The Allies also operated a network of double agents who fed the Nazi leaders all manner of fabricated information about troop movements. Juan Pujol Garcia, codenamed Garbo, created his own fake network of agents who provided him with information that he passed on to his German handlers about Allied preparations. The plan worked. Hitler was convinced that the Pas-de-Calais would be where the main thrust of the Allied attack would come. As a result, when D-Day occurred, Hitler ordered that vital reinforcements be kept in reserve to counter the attack across the Straits of Dover at Pas-de-Calais. This paralysis of Germany's military machine gave the Allies the chance they needed to create a foothold on mainland Europe. Without Fortitude's decoy army, the real one would have suffered even worse casualties on D-Day and may have failed in their objective entirely. Creating a lookalike army is impressive, but what about finding a city's double? No, I haven't been at the magic mushrooms again. I refer to the ruse during World War I when the French built a fake Paris to fool German bombers. An area about 15 miles outside the French capital was picked on a stretch of the River Seine, which was similar to that at Paris itself. There, areas of the city around the Arc de Triomphe and suburbs like Saint-Denis were recreated. Wooden replicas of the Champs-Élysées and the Gare du Nord were erected, and lighting effects using white, yellow and red lamps were employed to give the impression of machinery in operation at night and of trains and tracks which appeared real. Special paint was even used to give the impression of dirty glass on factory roofs. It was all in vain though. The replica was still being built when the Germans made their final air raid on Paris in September 1918. Less than 2 months later, the war ended. Still, you can't fault the French for effort.